The Crethean Empire ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their crimson warships brought fear to every corner of space. They controlled 200 different alien species and treated them all like property. When their scouts found Earth in 2187, they saw nothing special about it. Just another weak planet full of primitives who would be easy to conquer and use for labor. Commander Zekthor led the invasion himself because he wanted to add Earth to his list of victories. The attack began without warning on a Tuesday morning. Giant alien ships appeared in the sky over every major city on the planet. New York burned first, and then Beijing and Mumbai and São Paulo. The plasma weapons from the Crethean ships melted buildings like candles and turned streets into rivers of molten glass. Admiral Kyle Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Valiant and watched his fleet die around him. He commanded 40 ships, which seemed like a lot until the enemy brought 400. The battle lasted 6 hours, but everyone knew the outcome after the first 10 minutes. Human weapons barely scratched the alien shields while their plasma cannons cut through Earthships like paper. Morrison called every captain in his fleet and told them to run. Some ships tried to escape to the outer solar system where civilian colony vessels were already fleeing. Most didn't make it. The Cretheans hunted them down methodically and destroyed them one by one. Morrison's own ship took a direct hit that killed half his crew. The bridge filled with smoke and the lights went out, but he kept giving orders in the dark. On the ground, things were even worse. The aliens landed troops in every city and rounded up survivors. They moved people into detention centers that appeared overnight. Huge transport ships landed in fields and parking lots to collect humans by the thousands. Jake Sullivan stood behind a fence in Colorado and held his wife Lisa while their daughter Emma cried. They had been farmers before the invasion. Now they were prisoners waiting to be shipped somewhere unknown. The Cretheans didn't explain anything to their captives. They just sorted people into groups based on health and age. The strong ones got green marks on their arms. The weak ones got red marks. Jake and Lisa both got green marks, but they saw others with red marks being taken away, and those people never came back. Everyone understood what that meant, but nobody talked about it because talking made it more real. Within 3 days, Earth surrendered. There was no government left to negotiate terms, and the aliens didn't want negotiations anyway. They wanted workers. 3 billion humans were processed and loaded onto transport ships. Families were separated without explanation. Jake watched Lisa and Emma disappear into a different ship, and he screamed her name until a guard shocked him unconscious with some kind of electric weapon. When Jake woke up, he was in a cargo hold with 2,000 other men. The ship jumped to hyperspace and the journey took weeks. Nobody knew where they were going. An old man named Carl Baker tried to keep spirits up by talking about Earth history. He had been a professor before the invasion, and he told stories about how humans survived ice ages and plagues and wars. Some people listened, but most just stared at the walls. They arrived at a moon called Velcora, which orbited a planet Jake couldn't name. The moon was gray and lifeless with thin air that made breathing hard. The Cretheans marched them into underground tunnels that went miles deep. This was a mining colony where they would extract rare minerals until they died or became too weak to work. The overseers made it clear that both outcomes were acceptable. The work was brutal, and the shifts were 16 hours long. Jake learned to operate drilling equipment that carved through solid rock. The tunnels were hot, and the air tasted like metal. Other humans worked beside him, and they were from everywhere. Chinese miners and Brazilian farmers and German engineers all mixed together in the darkness. The Cretheans had scattered humanity across their empire to prevent any kind of organization. But something unexpected happened in those tunnels. People started talking. They shared memories of Earth and told each other about their families. Jake talked about his farm and how Emma loved to chase the chickens. A woman named Megan Torres talked about working on the lunar shipyards before the invasion. Carl Baker kept giving history lessons during the short meal breaks. The aliens thought they had broken humanity by separating them, but instead they were building something new. Months passed and the work continued. Some people died from accidents or exhaustion. The Cretheans replaced them with new workers and never bothered to learn anyone's name. But the humans learned each other's names, and they remembered the ones who died. They carved those names into tunnel walls when the guards weren't looking. Jake found out that Lisa and Emma were alive. A new arrival from another moon had seen them working on an agricultural world called Torin. The news almost broke Jake because they were so far apart, but it also gave him something to hold on to. He worked his shifts and survived each day and dreamed about seeing his family again. Admiral Morrison also survived, but barely. His ship crashed on an asteroid in the outer solar system, where a few thousand refugees had gathered. They salvaged what they could from destroyed vessels and built a hidden station they called Defiance. Morrison took command because someone had to, and he spent every day planning revenge. They had maybe 8,000 people total, including civilians. The Crethean Empire had trillions. But Morrison didn't care about the odds. He gathered every engineer and pilot and soldier he could find. They started building ships from scrap metal and stolen parts. The work was slow and dangerous, but nobody complained because they all wanted the same thing. They wanted to hurt the aliens who took their world. On Velkara, Jake and Carl and others found a collapsed tunnel that the guards had forgotten about. They cleared it out and carved a hidden chamber where they could meet in secret. More people joined them and they started planning. Nobody knew exactly what they were planning for, but it felt important to be ready. Megan Torres used her engineering knowledge to study Crethean equipment and find its weaknesses. Similar things were happening on other worlds. Humans were supposed to be broken and divided. Instead, they were organizing and learning and preparing. The Cretheans had conquered 200 species over 3,000 years, and they thought humans would be just like all the others. They were wrong. 2 years after Earth fell, the Crethean Empire believed the human problem was solved. Reports from across occupied space showed that human slaves were working efficiently and causing minimal trouble. The overseers felt comfortable enough to reduce security at some facilities. This was their first mistake. Jake Sullivan stood in the hidden chamber beneath Velkara with 50 other miners. They had expanded the space over many months and the guards still didn't know it existed. Carl Baker addressed the group with news that changed everything. A young woman named Megan Torres had managed to build a communication device from stolen Crethean parts. Megan held up the small machine she created. It looked like junk, but it could send and receive messages across short distances. More importantly, she had used it to contact other groups. Her face was serious when she told them they weren't alone. Resistance cells had formed on 17 different worlds and they were all talking to each other. The room went silent. Jake felt his heart pound because this meant something bigger than he imagined was happening. Humans across the galaxy were organizing. They were preparing for something. Carl asked the obvious question about what they should do next, and Megan smiled for the first time in months. She said they should fight back. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would sabotage the mining equipment on Velkara and send a message to the Cretheans that humans would not be obedient slaves. Other cells on other worlds would do the same thing at the same time. It would hurt the Empire's production and show other enslaved species that resistance was possible. Jake volunteered immediately, and Lisa would have wanted him to be brave. 20 others joined him, including Carl, despite his age. They spent weeks planning every detail. Megan showed them which parts of the drilling platform were most vulnerable. They collected explosives from mining charges, one tiny piece at a time. The guards never noticed because humans were supposed to be too defeated to cause trouble. On the agricultural world of Torin, Lisa Sullivan was leading her own resistance cell. She worked in fields growing food for Crethean colonies, and she had become friends with a former Marine named Rachel Kim. Rachel taught the farm workers how to fight using hand-to-hand combat techniques. They practiced in the fields during work hours, and the overseers thought they were just doing stretches. Rachel explained that Cretheans had different anatomy than humans. They were strong but slower in high gravity. Their hearts were in different places and their vision wasn't as good in certain light conditions. Every species had weaknesses and humans were good at finding and exploiting weaknesses. This is how humanity survived on Earth for millions of years. Meanwhile, on a factory station orbiting a planet called Kelmar Prime, a man named Daniel Cross was teaching people to fly. He had been a shuttle pilot before the invasion, and now the Cretheans used him to move cargo between stations. They watched him, but not carefully enough. Daniel memorized every security protocol and studied every ship system. He taught others during secret meetings behind cargo containers. Daniel believed that the key to escape was in the ships themselves. If humans could steal enough vessels, they could start evacuating people to safe locations. It was a long-term plan, but someone had to think long-term. His students included mechanics and engineers who understood how the alien technology worked. They were building knowledge that might save lives someday. Far beyond Neptune, Admiral Morrison stood in the command center of Station Defiance and looked at a star map. Red dots marked every known location where humans were enslaved. There were hundreds of dots scattered across the galaxy. His chief tactical officer, Ryan Blake, stood beside him and reported that contact had been established with resistance cells on 23 worlds. Morrison asked how many people were actively involved in resistance work. Blake estimated at least 50,000, with potentially millions more who sympathized but couldn't act openly. Morrison nodded slowly because he had been planning something big for 2 years. He called his senior staff together and explained that the time had come to move from hiding to action. The plan was audacious. They would strike Crithian supply lines and force the Empire to respond. Each attack would be coordinated with uprisings on slave worlds. The aliens would have to split their forces between defending their infrastructure and controlling their slaves. It wouldn't win the war, but it would show everyone that humans could fight. Engineer Nathan Wells reported that they had completed the first batch of modified fighters. The ships looked rough because they were built from salvaged parts, but they would fly and they could fight. Morrison walked to the construction bay and watched workers welding hull plates onto a vessel that used to be 3 different ships. Human ingenuity was turning garbage into weapons. Morrison asked Wells how long until the fleet was ready for combat. Wells thought about it and said 6 months if they pushed hard. Morrison accepted this timeline because 6 months would give the resistance cells time to prepare their operations. He recorded a message to be sent through the secret network that Megan and others had built. The message was simple. Admiral Kyle Morrison told every enslaved human that they had not been forgotten. He said that Earth's military survived and was preparing to fight. He asked them to hold on and stay strong because the reckoning was coming. The message included a date 3 months away when the first coordinated strikes would begin. Jake received the message in the hidden chamber on Velkara 3 weeks later. He played it for everyone and watched hope spread across faces that had known only despair for years. Carl stood up and spoke about human history again. He reminded them that humanity survived countless challenges, ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters. Humans always found a way to continue. Lisa received the same message on Torin and showed it to Rachel Kim. The former Marine smiled and said it was time to teach people how to kill. Not just how to fight, but how to kill efficiently and effectively, because when the day came they would have one chance to strike, and they needed to make it count. Daniel Cross received the message on his factory station and immediately began planning something ambitious. He would steal a cargo ship and fill it with volunteers. When the uprising began, they would fly it straight into the station's reactor and destroy the entire facility. It was a suicide mission, but Daniel had already decided he would rather die fighting than live as a slave. All across the galaxy, humans prepared for war. They sharpened tools into weapons. They memorized guard patterns. They identified targets and escape routes. The Crithians noticed nothing because they believed humans were broken. This was their second mistake. Morrison's fleet grew day by day. More refugees found their way to Station Defiance. More ships took shape in the construction yards. More weapons were tested and crews were trained. The Admiral spent his nights planning and his days inspiring people who had lost everything except the will to fight. He knew the odds were terrible, and most of them would probably die. But he also knew that doing nothing was worse than death. Humanity deserved to be free, and if Morrison had to burn the entire galaxy to make that happen, he would do it gladly. The Crethians had awakened something they didn't understand. They had awakened human wrath. The Crethian supply station at Gorvek Terminal hung in space like a massive metal flower. It coordinated shipments to 47 different worlds and served as a critical hub for the Empire's logistics network. Security was tight but routine, because nothing had threatened a Crethian installation in living memory. This made it the perfect first target. Daniel Cross sat in the pilot seat of a cargo shuttle and ran through his pre-flight checklist. His Crethian overseer barely looked at him because Daniel had been flying this route for months. The alien didn't know that this shuttle had been secretly modified. Hidden compartments held weapons and explosives. The cargo bay contained 12 human fighters instead of supplies. The shuttle lifted off and flew toward Gorvek Terminal without incident. Daniel kept his face neutral even though his heart was racing. In the back, Rachel Kim and her team checked their weapons one last time. These weren't soldiers anymore, but they remembered how to fight. Rachel had trained them well during secret sessions on Torin. Traffic control cleared the shuttle to dock, and Daniel brought it in smoothly. Krethian workers began unloading cargo, and Daniel waited until most of them left the bay. Then he triggered the signal. Rachel and her team exploded from hiding, and the fight began. The Krethians in the docking bay were armed but completely surprised. They had grown comfortable over centuries of unchallenged power. The humans moved with desperate fury and years of stored rage. Within 3 minutes, the bay was secure and the team pushed deeper into the station. Alarms began wailing almost immediately. Rachel led her fighters toward the reactor level while Krethian security forces mobilized. The humans fought their way through corridors, paying for every meter in blood. A young man named Peter Davis took a plasma bolt to the chest and died instantly. Sarah Hill lost her arm but kept fighting with her face twisted in rage. The humans had nothing left to lose, and that made them terrifying. They reached the reactor level with 4 survivors. Rachel set the charges herself while the others held the entrance against increasing enemy fire. The charges would overload the magnetic containment and cause a catastrophic explosion. She armed them and called out that they had 2 minutes before detonation. Daniel's voice crackled over their stolen communication devices. The station was in lockdown and all shuttles were grounded. There was no escape route. Rachel understood immediately that this had always been a one-way mission. She told her team it had been an honor and they prepared to die. At the same moment on Velkara, Jake Sullivan and his miners struck their target. They had spent months identifying the main drilling platform that processed most of the moon's mineral output. Destroying it wouldn't free them, but it would hurt the Krethians badly. They planted their charges during a shift change when security was lightest. The explosion lit up the dark side of the moon and could be seen from orbit. Krethian response teams arrived to find the platform in ruins, and the human workers just standing there. They made no attempt to escape because there was nowhere to run. The overseer named Commander Thalrek stared at the destruction in disbelief. He demanded to know why they would do this when they knew they would be punished. Jake stepped forward and met the alien's eyes. He said they did it because they were humans and the Krethians had made a mistake thinking they could be kept down. Thalrek shot him in the chest and Jake fell dying in the alien dirt. But as he died, Jake smiled because he saw fear in the overseer's face for the first time. Similar attacks happened across Krethian space in a coordinated wave. On Torin, human workers sabotaged agricultural processors and destroyed months' worth of food production. On factory stations orbiting Mektar, humans killed 50 overseers before being gunned down themselves. Every attack followed the same pattern: strike hard and accept death rather than continued slavery. The psychological impact rippled through the empire. Other enslaved species watched with growing interest. The Krethians had seemed invincible for 3,000 years, but now they were bleeding. If humans could fight back despite being primitive and recently conquered, then maybe others could resist too. On Kreth Prime, the Emperor sat on his throne and listened to damage reports with growing fury. High Commander Drekthar explained that the attacks were coordinated across too many worlds to be random. Someone was organizing human resistance on a massive scale. The Emperor ordered harsh reprisals and public executions to make examples of the rebels. But the executions only made things worse. Humans who witnessed them became more angry rather than more afraid. The Krethians had spent 3,000 years conquering species that eventually accepted defeat. They didn't understand humans who seemed to get more dangerous the more you hurt them. 3 weeks after the first wave of attacks, Gorvek Terminal exploded. The massive supply station that served 47 worlds was destroyed utterly. 3,000 Krethian personnel died, and supply lines throughout the region collapsed. Investigation teams found only one thing intact. A message burned into the docking bay hull in crude English letters: "Remember planet Earth." The message spread through the Krethian military network and reached every installation in the Empire. Enslaved humans saw it and understood. Somewhere out there, free humans were fighting back. The battle had begun and they weren't alone anymore. Hope spread like wildfire through slave populations. Admiral Morrison received news of Gorvek Terminal's destruction with mixed emotions. The mission succeeded, but all 13 humans who infiltrated the station died. Rachel Kim and Daniel Cross and 11 others gave their lives. Morrison recorded their names carefully because heroes deserve to be remembered. Lieutenant Amy Foster stood beside him and said quietly that they were heroes. Morrison agreed and said they would honor those deaths by making them count. He turned to his assembled staff and stationed defiance and announced that Phase 1 was complete. The Krethians knew humans were dangerous now. Phase 2 would be different. Morrison explained that small strikes had proven humans could fight. Now they needed to prove humans could win. He ordered the fleet to prepare for a major offensive against a significant military target. They would take the war directly to the Empire's doorstep and show the galaxy what human wrath really looked like. Around him, officers moved with renewed purpose. Ships were being armed and crews were training hard. The modified vessels looked strange with their mismatched parts and improvised weapons, but they would fly and they would fight. Every person in the fleet understood they might die, but they also understood they would die free. Morrison stood alone later and looked at the star map showing all the worlds where humans were enslaved. He thought about Jake Sullivan and Rachel Kim and everyone who died striking the first blows. They had bought time with their lives. Now Morrison had to make sure their sacrifice meant something. The Krethian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years by crushing anyone who opposed them. But they had never faced an enemy like humanity. An enemy that refused to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. An enemy that would burn the entire galaxy down rather than live in chains. The Admiral smiled grimly. The Krethians wanted to know what humans were capable of when pushed to the edge. He was about to show them. The battle fleet was almost ready, and when it launched, the Empire would learn the most important lesson. Never enslave humans. Because they always fight back. 6 months after Gorvek Terminal burned, Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the EFS Retribution and watched his fleet assemble. 47 combat vessels emerged from hiding spots throughout the asteroid field. They were an odd collection built from salvaged parts and desperation, but they were armed and crewed and ready for war. Captain Ryan Blake reported final numbers. 47 combat vessels and 23 support ships with a total crew of 19,000 personnel. Against the might of the Krethian Empire, it was laughably small. The Empire could field thousands of warships, but Morrison wasn't planning to fight the entire Empire at once. He was planning to cut off its head. Morrison opened a channel to the entire fleet. He told them they had hidden for 2 years and prepared in darkness. Today they would stop running. Today they would remind the galaxy that humanity does not bow to anyone. Across the fleet, crews listened and prepared themselves mentally for what was coming. Commander Linda Hayes stood on the bridge of the EFS Defiant and ran final weapons checks. Her ship was smaller than Retribution but faster and more maneuverable. She had handpicked every crew member. Veterans who survived the battle for Earth and had nothing left except the burning need for revenge. The target was carefully chosen. The Krethian military shipyard at Poltec, located only 3 jumps from their homeworld. It was one of their most important facilities producing warships that enforced Imperial control across the galaxy. Intelligence suggested 40 combat vessels were currently stationed there along with defensive platforms and shields. Morrison was bringing 47 ships against a fortified military installation deep in enemy territory. The Krethian commanders would laugh when they detected the human fleet. A handful of primitive vessels attacking the Empire's industrial heart seemed like suicide. The human fleet jumped into hyperspace. They emerged at the edge of the Poltec system in perfect formation. Alarms immediately screamed across Krethian channels. An unknown fleet had appeared in one of their most secure systems. Admiral Krentok commanded the shipyard defenses and stared at his displays in confusion. The sensor readings showed strange vessels built from various technologies. His sensor officer identified Earth-type propulsion systems. Krentok felt his blood chill because humans were supposed to be conquered slaves. Their world was occupied and their military destroyed. Yet here was a human fleet in the heart of Krethian space. He ordered his ships to mobilize and defensive platforms to activate. Morrison watched the Krethian response and smiled. They were reacting exactly as predicted, scrambling combat vessels and bringing weapons online. Standard defensive procedure against a conventional attack. But this would not be a conventional attack. He ordered Commander Nathan Wells to execute Maneuver 7. The human fleet suddenly split apart with ships peeling off in multiple directions. It looked like chaos, and the Krethians interpreted it as panic. They adjusted defensive positions to deal with scattered, disorganized targets. They realized their mistake too late. Each human ship carried weapons built on principles from Earth's violent history. Kinetic weapons and railguns that the Krethians had never encountered. The aliens had energy shields designed to deflect plasma and particle beams. These shields worked perfectly against Krethian weapons. They were far less effective against tungsten rods fired at extreme velocity. The EFS Vengeance fired first. Captain Susan Grant launched a spread of missiles that accelerated toward a Krethian battlecruiser. Point defense systems destroyed most of them, but not all. The ones that got through didn't explode. They just kept accelerating until they punched straight through shields and hull. The battlecruiser broke apart as the kinetic projectiles tumbled through it at hypervelocity. Its death scream broadcast across all channels. Admiral Krentok shouted that it was impossible because their shields should have stopped the attack. Another human ship fired and another Krethian vessel died. Morrison ordered all ships to focus on the shipyard facilities, ignore the warships unless directly threatened. Their goal was to destroy the Empire's ability to build more ships. The human fleet dove toward the orbital yards with reckless aggression. Krethian vessels tried to intercept, but humans were fighting with desperate ferocity. Ships that took damage didn't retreat. They accelerated toward enemy positions and turned themselves into weapons. The EFS Redemption took fatal damage from a Krethian dreadnought. Captain Marcus Flynn knew his ship was dying. He plotted a collision course with the largest shipyard facility. His last transmission was simple. For Earth, the impact destroyed both the Redemption and the Yard along with 5 vessels under construction. The explosion lit up space like a star being born. Blake reported that multiple facilities were destroyed. 60% reduction in production capacity. But 7 human ships were destroyed and 12 more severely damaged. Morrison felt each loss like a physical blow. Every ship meant hundreds of lives. Irreplaceable people who would never see Earth again. But they came here to send a message, and messages required sacrifice. He ordered the fleet to execute withdrawal sequence. The human fleet began pulling back while still fighting. Krethians tried to pursue, but their formations were broken. In less than 1 hour, humans had struck at the heart of Krethian military power and survived. As the last ships jumped to hyperspace, Morrison recorded a message on all Krethian channels. He identified himself as Admiral Kyle Morrison of the Earth Federal Fleet. He reminded them that 2 years ago their empire invaded his world. They killed billions and enslaved survivors. They thought humans were weak and would submit quietly. They were catastrophically wrong. Morrison told them this attack was just the beginning. Humans would strike again and again. They would free their people and burn the empire to ash. The Krethians wanted to know what humans were capable of when pushed to the edge. Now they knew. This was humanity's answer. Unending wrath. The message ended with an image of Earth's flag still flying. On Kreth Prime, Emperor Cal then watched the message 3 times. His rage was terrible, but underneath was something new. Fear. He ordered his military to find the human fleet and exterminate every human in the galaxy. He wanted the species erased completely. High Commander Drekthar bowed but felt cold dread. The humans had assembled a fleet from nothing and struck deep inside Imperial space. If they could do that, then what else were they capable of? His fears were confirmed when reports flooded in from across the Empire. The Poltec attack had been a signal. Resistance cells on dozens of worlds launched simultaneous uprisings. Slave populations rioted. Sabotage increased everywhere. Humans fought with the same message. Remember Earth. The empire that stood unchallenged for millennia was suddenly fighting wars on 100 fronts. In slave camps and mines and factories, humans heard about Poltec. They heard Morrison's message. They understood they were not alone anymore. Somewhere out there, free humans were fighting back and winning. Jake Sullivan's widow, Lisa, stood with other workers on Torin. They had stolen access to a communication terminal and watched footage of the battle. Ships bearing Earth's colors tearing through Krethian formations. Shipyards burning. Warships dying. Carl Baker gripped her shoulder and said they actually did it. Lisa nodded with tears streaming down her face. She thought about Jake, who died on Velkara during the first uprising. She thought about Emma, hidden with other children in a secret location. She thought about Admiral Morrison's words. Unending wrath. Around her, exhausted workers straightened their backs. Hope spread like fire. The Krethians conquered Earth, but conquering humanity was proving impossible. The age of uncontested Krethian dominion was ending, and it was ending because they made one critical mistake. They thought humans could be broken. 3 months after the Poltec raid, the Krethian Empire was fighting fires across its territory. Admiral Morrison's fleet had struck 17 more targets with the same pattern. Swift, brutal attacks designed to inflict maximum damage while minimizing human casualties. The Crethians tried to adapt, but they were fighting an enemy that broke every rule they understood. Emperor Cal then had assembled a task force of 200 ships under Fleet Commander Velcor, specifically to hunt down and destroy the human insurgents. Velcor was the Empire's finest military mind. He studied everything known about humans and analyzed their tactics. After weeks of calculations, he found their weakness. They were protecting something. Every attack was carefully planned to preserve their own forces. They weren't suicidal despite their aggression, which meant there must be a base somewhere, a place they needed to defend. His analysts ran projections and narrowed it down to a region beyond the former Sol system. Velcor assembled his fleet and jumped toward human space. Admiral Morrison received warning from a scout ship. A massive Crethian fleet was inbound to the outer system. 200 combat vessels heavily armed and moving in formation. They would reach Station Defiance in 6 hours. The command center erupted in controlled chaos. Morrison had 47 ships against 200, and this time they couldn't run because Station Defiance held everything that remained of free humanity, 6,000 civilians and the last of Earth's military. If they lost here, then humanity was finished. Ryan Blake said they couldn't win a straight fight. Even with tactical advantages, they were outnumbered 4-1. Lieutenant Amy Foster spoke up. Then they don't fight fair. Morrison looked at her and told her to explain. Amy brought up a display showing the asteroid field around Station Defiance. They had spent 2 years mapping every rock and ice formation. The Crethians didn't know the field. If they could lure the enemy into it and use asteroids for cover, maybe they could negate the numerical advantage. Nathan Wells suggested seeding the field with mines and rigging asteroids with explosives. Turn the entire sector into a death trap. Morrison considered this for a long moment. It was risky, but they had no other options. He ordered every ship and crew member to prepare. They had 6 hours to set up the biggest ambush in human history. The fleet mobilized with practiced efficiency. Ships took positions behind asteroids. Engineers placed mines and rigged explosives. Pilots volunteered for dangerous assignments knowing some wouldn't return. On the EFS Defiant, Commander Linda Hayes addressed her crew one last time. She told them honestly that the odds were terrible. They would probably die today, but if they died, they would take as many Crethians with them as possible, and they would buy time for civilians to survive. Her tactical officer, Greg Ross, said it had been an honor. Linda smiled grimly and told him they weren't dead yet. The Crethian fleet emerged from hyperspace precisely on schedule. Fleet Commander Velcor studied sensor readings with satisfaction. The asteroid field was exactly where predicted. Deep within it, power signatures indicated a significant installation. He ordered his ships to advance in standard assault formation. They entered the field confidently. The finest warriors in the galaxy with the best technology and leadership. A few primitive humans hiding in asteroids were barely worth concern. The first mine detonated 10 minutes later. The explosion tore through a Crethian cruiser's shields and killed half the crew. Before Velcor could react, 3 more ships hit mines. Then asteroids began exploding. Enormous rocks rigged with enough explosive to shatter hulls. Velcor's sensor officer screamed that the entire field was weaponized. Velcor ordered a retreat, but pulling back exposed engines to direct fire. Human ships emerged from hiding with railguns blazing. The EFS Retribution came in fast, with Morrison directing the attack personally. All batteries fired, targeting command ships first. Tungsten rounds hammered Crethian vessels. The aliens tried to return fire, but asteroids provided cover. Human ships moved fast and erratically, darting between rocks like angry insects, striking and retreating before return fire could be coordinated. Linda Hayes brought the Defiant past a battleship at point-blank range, firing directly into its engines. The enemy vessel lost power and drifted into another Crethian ship. Greg Ross shouted that this was insane and brilliant at the same time. The battle devolved into chaos, which was exactly what Morrison wanted. In tight confines, the Crethians couldn't use superior numbers. Ships collided trying to maneuver. Mines continued exploding. Human vessels attacked with suicidal courage. Velcor tried to restore order, but humans had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. Asteroids weren't just cover. They were obstacles that humans navigated instinctively while Crethian pilots struggled. He ordered ships to destroy the largest asteroids and eliminate cover. It was sound strategy, but implementing it took time. Morrison didn't give them time. Wave after wave of attacks kept Crethians off balance, forcing them to react instead of act. The EFS Justice, heavily damaged and leaking atmosphere, made one final run at a dreadnought. Captain Alex Turner broadcast a simple message for everyone who couldn't fight back. The impact destroyed both ships. Hours into battle, the Crethean fleet was in chaos. 20 ships destroyed and 40 more damaged. Formations broken and command structure failing. The humans kept coming relentless as a force of nature. Velcor finally acknowledged the impossible. He was losing. Against an enemy with a fraction of his numbers, fighting in conditions that negated every advantage, he was being beaten. Pride fought survival instinct, but survival won. He ordered all ships to retreat and exit the asteroid field. The Crethean fleet pulled back, battered and demoralized. They came to destroy humanity's last refuge. Instead, they suffered the first major defeat in living memory. Morrison watched them go, knowing he couldn't pursue. His fleet was hurt too. 15 ships destroyed and many more damaged. But they won. Against impossible odds, they held the line. Amy Foster reported they were receiving transmissions from resistance cells across the galaxy. Everyone watched the battle. Everyone knew humans won. On Velcara, Carl Baker stood with hundreds of miners watching stolen footage. When they saw the alien fleet retreat, a roar echoed through tunnels. The Crethean overseer arrived with guards to crush this gathering. But when he saw human faces no longer defeated, he hesitated. Lisa Sullivan stepped forward. "We're done taking orders from you." It wasn't violent. Humans simply stopped obeying. They walked away from posts and gathered together. Guards could have fired, but thousands of humans faced a dozen guards. And humans didn't look like victims anymore. Similar reports flooded in from across the Empire. Slave populations refusing work, sabotage increasing, uprisings on nearly every world. Humans were conquered but refused to stay conquered. On Kreth Prime Emperor Cal then faced an impossible choice. Exterminate all humans, but that would cripple the economy. Or negotiate, which was poison to imperial pride. High Commander Drekthar presented the situation starkly. They were losing control and risked systemic collapse. The Emperor raged, but beneath rage was fear. Drekthar suggested releasing humans and returning Earth before they tore the Empire apart. It took months of negotiation through neutral parties. The Crethians wanted guarantees. Morrison wanted reparations and ships to transport people home. 1 year after Station Defiance, the first transport ships began returning humans to Earth. Crethean forces withdrew in defeat. The planet was scarred and cities were ruins, but it was theirs again. Jake Sullivan's widow Lisa stood on Earth soil holding Emma. Around them, thousands of humans experienced the same moment. The return home. Carl Baker, ancient and frail, knelt and kissed the ground. "We made it," he whispered. "We actually made it." Admiral Morrison addressed crowds from the ruined UN building. He said they were conquered and enslaved and written off as defeated. But they refused to accept that fate. They fought and bled and died. And they won. The crowd erupted in cheers. Morrison continued that the Crethean Empire learned something. Humanity cannot be broken. They can be hurt and knocked down, but they always get back up. Always. He looked over scarred faces that remained unbowed. The Empire called humans primitive and weak. But they learned to fear humanity. Because when you enslave humans and threaten everything they hold dear, you don't face an army. You face wrath itself. Pure, unending human wrath. Reconstruction would take decades. Scars would never fully heal. Millions died and those losses could never be recovered. But humanity survived. They faced a galactic empire and refused to bow. Across the galaxy, other subjugated species watched and learned. The Crethean Empire, once unshakable, now knew fear. Because if humans could resist, then maybe others could too. The age of uncontested Crethean dominion was over. It ended because they made one critical mistake. They thought humans could be conquered. They were wrong.